In the year 1885, my grandparents brought my granddad to this country. They came from Kovno in the Ukraine and settled in the United States in a place called Marietta, Ohio. And then one day there was a discovery. The discovery was oil.
We're in the money, we're in the money.
They decided in time, as the demand for oil and drilling increased, they decided to go into pipe and supply. Pipe and supply is the activity that is engaged in by people who want to drill. And the common term that was employed was wildcatter. A lot of people didn't know what that meant. Wildcatting meant that a fellow who wanted to find oil would go out and look for oil somewhere where it would otherwise not be found. My granddad and a friend of his, a fellow by the name of Lou Sinclair, got on horseback one day and decided they were going to become wildcatters. They were very successful. Both of them struck oil. Both of them initiated their own companies, and both of them continue to become very wealthy. The success in the oil fields allowed my granddad to build a beautiful, wonderful, big house in Tulsa. And it was a house in which my mother, Miriam, was born. And subsequently, in more recent years, obviously, became the Tulsa Historical Society. My granddad had made a decision to send his children, his two eldest daughters, to Germany to school because he was an Orthodox Jew and he wanted those girls to have a chance to go to a Jewish school. My granddad, having been an Orthodox Jew and an avid Zionist, was most interested in participating in activities that were productive for American Jewry. And he built, for example, the Yeshiva University in New York. But the Yeshiva University had been built with a gold dome. My granddad had told his brother-in-law, who he had appointed as the dean of the university. His brother-in-law's name was Dr. Bernard Revel. And he had asked Bernard Revel to be sure that in the event that there was any difficulty with the university, that gold was to be used to pay expenses. And in fact, during the Depression, the gold was used. It was used to maintain the university, and it paid for many of the students who couldn't pay. It became a very, very major scholarship fund for the university. At any rate, there were other things that my granddad engaged in, and they were, for example, his friend Baron Rothschild had visited with my granddad and had asked him if he had a recommendation. And the recommendation that he was looking for was for a pious Jewish man, Orthodox man, to be able to help him establish the winery and then manage it. And the winery was called Rishon LeZion, which today is a very, very big and well-known kosher Jewish winery in Israel. That relationship between Mr. Shapiro, who was the man who became the manager of the winery, and Baron Rothschild and the Rothschild family lasted many more than 25 years. Kosher being a very, very important thing to Jewish people, he discovered that the mob was selling non-kosher meat as kosher meat. And he went about the business of using his influence with the legislature in New York, the state of New York, to see to it that all meat that was slaughtered for consumption in the state of New York was slaughtered kosher. And that went on right through till World War II. During the course of all of this traveling and his philanthropic activities, my granddad had occasion to get back to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and look after his business. And at one point, he was offered to by Rockefeller to buy his whole business. My grandfather said no. He was having too good a time, and he didn't want to sell his business. Well, Rockefeller made him pay for the no. He used all of his influence and all of his ability to crush my granddad and his business, and he was more than a bit successful at it. My mother, after having left Germany, came to America for a short time, but then in a year or so, went to Palestine. She went to Palestine because she was going to meet my dad. They lived together after they got married in a house in which they had meetings for the Haganah. For those of you who might not know what the Haganah is, the Haganah was the early military force for Israel. Palestine at that time was under British mandate and British rule. So the meetings that took place in the house for the Haganah, that also required them to hide their weaponry under floorboards in the house. Subsequently, my granddad also engaged in other activities that were helpful for the Jewish community in what was then called Palestine. He discovered that there were Jewish people who were living in caves. They were that poor. They didn't even have shoes to wear. So he arranged that they should come to a square on a particular day, bring whatever shoes they needed or had that needed repairs, and he had at the same time asked shoemakers to come to that square, and he paid for it all. The following week, there were a number of Jewish philanthropists in New York at the time who also were Zionists, and they asked my granddad, they said, "Sam, is there any way that we can give you money to assist you in the things that you're doing?" And my granddad said, "No, don't give me money, buy flour, and have the flour delivered as much as you can to the harbor, to pier whatever it was, because before a certain date, because a freighter that he had engaged was going to go to Palestine with that flour." And in fact, that flour went to a bakery that is still in existence today. And the name of the bakery is the Angel Bakery. And the admonition was that any poor person who needed to have bread could come in and have as much every day as he needed or they needed. And that flour lasted over a year. In time, my mother became aware of the fact that General Rommel, who was known as the Desert Fox, who commanded the Desert Army, German Army, who were in a tank corps, were awfully close. And she was very worried and decided this is a time to leave and come to America. So she took me and my sister and arrived in America in short order. I was about 3 years old at the time. In any event, at the end of the war, Mom, my mother, Miriam Heller, went about the business of assisting a UNESCO entity with the UN. And the type of work that she did had to do with placement of children who were survivors in the camps or had been hidden in Christian homes. But these children didn't know who their parents were. And Mom had traveled there, and on certain occasions she would say the word Shema Yisrael, which all Jews know is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one." And the children would react to that because they had heard that as babies. And they would say, "Ma, Mama." And my mother then knew that these children were Jewish. The man that was working with her, who was the head of that unit, the UN unit, continued to bring pictures of these children home to the United States, to my mother. When I saw those stacks of pictures of those children who were survivors of the war, I was perhaps somewhere at the age of about 6 or 7, and it was a terrible moment. The look on the faces of those children is something I will never forget. The horror in their eyes, the disbelief that I had that they had to go through the things that they went through. It stayed with me. It hurt me. The images come up very, very easily in my mind, and I shall never forget. At the conclusion of the Six-Day War, Mom had in her mind to go to Israel to see how the graves of her antecedents, her parents, her great-grandparents, who were buried at the Mount of Olives. She had been involved in the purchase of those graves, and in some instances had exhumed bodies from other parts of the world and brought them there because they wanted to be buried in Israel. Mom had occasion to get to the cemetery, and she was absolutely shocked at the devastation and at how awfully the Jordanian armies who had come to Jerusalem had desecrated the Mount of Olives, which was the cemetery in question, the oldest cemetery in the old world. And they had destroyed the grave sites. They had taken the tombstone covers, which were all engraved, and they had used them in the latrines. They had used them to make roads. They had used them for all kinds of activities and purposes that were certainly not what they were intended for. And Mom had, when she came to Israel at that time, she had maps with her. She had the ability to identify the locations of where those grandparents and great-grandparents. There were some rabbis who were now in charge of the operation of the cemetery. And they, having come back to the offices at the cemetery, had discovered that all the records had been destroyed. And they saw that she had these maps. They first asked her, "What are you doing?" And she explained. And then she showed the maps, and they fell to their knees, asking my mother to please allow them to copy those maps. And that was a very successful moment because those maps were the ones that were determined to do, and those grave sites became the focal point of identifying most of the rest of that cemetery. So the Mount of Olives was able to be restored successfully, and it was a great moment for my mother, a great moment, and never spoken of by her. She never told me about that until recently when she was buried. It was mentioned at her funeral at the Mount of Olives. And she was then buried with her parents and her grandparents and her great-grandparents at the Mount of Olives. A dedication on her part that could not in any way ever be repaid to her. She was a wonderful lady, a wonderful lady. That was a successful effort on her part, believe me, quite successful. She heard from many of them as years went by, and they sent her beautiful letters. She would say the word Shema Yisrael.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Oh, and that's why we sing Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Oh, and that's why we sing.
That's my family. That's what they did with their wealth and their time and their effort. And I'm oh so proud of all of them. Thank you.
That he controls my life. I won't tell you that to have his love would be my everlasting plight. But I can say as loud and clear as I can sing from my lips to your ears that there's one of our God. Our near time need our everlasting